This lecture focuses on the factors that stimulated the unprecedented industrial and agricultural growth in the late 19th century. The entrepreneurs who pioneered the growth of big business, their goals and strategies they used to dominate their respective industries. It also looks at the role the federal government played in the nation's economic development during this period, and the class structure of the middle class and working class, and the lives of women that changed in the late 19th century. The lecture also discusses the efforts of workers to organize unions to promote their interests, and will end with the popular culture of the Golden Age. Industrial and agricultural growth. First, we're going to look at agriculture. With things that have changed to make agriculture more mechanized and therefore freeing up more and more labor, agriculture also went through a time of corporations. Large bonanza farms ran like factories with professional managers and helped move the agricultural economy further away from small farms and toward an industrial model. The corporatized agricultural and industrial sectors helped stimulate each other, and by 1870, the United States emerged as the world's leading producer of agricultural products, specifically wheat. Technological innovations. The growth of manufacturing after the Civil War sparked an innovative streak in Americans, resulting in inventions such as barbed wire, refrigerated boxcars, air brakes for trains, and the telephone. Changes in production methods that focused on mass production and efficiency allowed industries to produce more products faster and at lower cost. Larger industries, due to economies of scale, were able to afford the expensive new technologies, and large workforces needed to boost their production all the more, which often undermined the abilities of smaller businesses to compete. For example, we look at Bell's telephone. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone began as a speaking telegraph in 1875 and was patented in 1876. Bell's American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, the same one we have today, expanded as Bell added long-distance telephone lines. By 1895, there were over 300,000 telephones in use, and people could communicate audibly across long distances in an instant. Typewriters and sewing. Typewriters and sewing machines. Office managers often viewed women as better candidates for typist positions because they worked for lower wages and were assumed to have greater manual dexterity. This led to an increase in clerical positions for women and opened economic opportunities for them, even though they continued to earn lower wages than men. Women also favored in industries such as the sewing machines. Sweatshops emerged in most cities and employed large numbers of young women, mostly immigrants, to sew clothing and linens in often dangerous conditions. Thomas Alva Edison emerged as America's most influential inventor. His experiments with patents on the mechanical inventions allowed him to perform more experiments as he gained a reputation as an innovator. He was able to focus on his experiments and inventions. He opened up a scientific village in Menlo Park, New Jersey in 1876, which was the nation's first industrial research laboratory. Edison and his assistants helped invent or adapt many technologies that changed people's lives. His long-lasting incandescent electric light bulb in 1879 probably had the largest impact, as people were able to work, study, and read for longer hours if they had access to electricity. Nikola Tesla, an apprentice of Edison, believed in alternating current, AC. Edison believed that the higher voltage AC is too dangerous and resigns to form his own company and joins George Westinghouse. Here he decides to invest into his company, and both believe that AC is more effective. Westinghouse and Western Electric Company developed the alternating current system for electricity, which allowed electric companies to transmit electricity at higher voltages. Along
electric wires, but stepped down using transformers closer to their points of use. Tesla, a Croatian immigrant who had worked for Edison, invented the alternating current motor dynamo, which he sold to Westinghouse, and AC emerged as the victor in the AC-DC competition. Electricity allowed companies to locate their factories in a wide range of areas instead of being limited by availability of geographical features such as running water or coal deposits.
The Railroad Revolution. Railroads allowed people and goods to move distances faster than ever before. Towns with train stations, especially in rural areas, tended to grow, whereas those that were not connected to railroads shrank or died. Railroads needed to stay on schedule to allow for more predictable deliveries and to avoid collisions, which led to the invention of both national and international time zones and increased the use of wristwatches. As railroads were constructed, telegraph wires and poles were installed alongside them, bringing transportation and communication across the nation. The first industries to represent big business or a corporation were the railroads, linking the western half of the continent to the economic development capabilities of the East. The Central Pacific Railroad, working east from Sacramento, California, and the Union, working from Omaha, Nebraska, built the first Transcontinental Railroad, meeting in 1865 at Pomeroy Point, Utah. The railroads were constructed by private companies, which raised the necessary funds by selling bonds. Originally, concerns about the constitutionality of federal involvement in financing railroads precluded the government from becoming involved in their construction. But beginning in the 1850s, schemes that provided federal land to the builders were approved. Building the Transcontinentals. According to General William Tecumseh Sherman, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was the work of giants. The railroads required major efforts and ingenuity on part of the surveyors, engineers, and workers who built them, and they required consistent funding sources and large labor forces. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 was passed by the largely Republican Congress during the Civil War, while the Southern Democrats mostly joined the Confederacy. It authorized the construction of a railway by two companies who would compete to construct a railway that connected the nation's railway network across the West from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. The Union Pacific Railroad Company began in Omaha and worked westward. Meanwhile, the Central Pacific Railroad Company began in Sacramento and moved eastward. Conditions for workers were harsh, and many workers were killed or injured during the project. The act spurred each company to work quickly and sometimes cut corners by granting more money to the company that laid the most track in the shortest amount of time. For railroad workers, such as the Union Pacific, were young, single, former Civil War veterans, both Confederate and Union soldiers, Irish and German immigrants, or African Americans who had once been slaves. Most of the Central Pacific workers, on the other hand, were young, single Chinese workers who had moved to California seeking gold or looking for jobs to raise money for their families back in China. Those so-called coolie laborers, manual laborers in Hindu, what the name coolie stands for, encouraged racial prejudice and discrimination, low pay, and dangerous conditions. However, they accomplished daunting tasks by working together. For these railroads involved a series of sequential tasks that often encountered interruptions or delays. Nonetheless, overall, the Union Pacific had constructed 1,086 miles of track, largely over prairie, but also included the Rocky Mountains. The Central Pacific built only 689 miles, but most of its route included the Rocky Mountains. On May 10, 1869, California's Governor Leland Stanford, a part-time owner of the Central Pacific Company, officially connected the two railway lines by driving the symbolic Golden Spike at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory. The rise of big business. Increasingly large corporations, collectively known as big business, helped enhance the United States economy and economic power internationally. This economic power gave increased influence on its company leaders and allowed them to bribe local, state, and national leaders to encourage them to continue supporting big business. Corporations are legally separate entities or bodies from their owners, which separate the ownership of the enterprise or business from its management operations, thus protecting their owners and part owners who purchase the shares of ownership through stocks. The two major advantages of corporations were that a corporation can outlive its founders, and its officials and shareholders are not personally liable for its debts, only what they invested in their stocks. An effect of the rise of the corporations in America was stimulated of capital investment and technological advances. Capitalist theory asserted that competition among businesses reduces corruption and increases innovation by preventing one group from taking control and stagnating. As giant corporations emerged during this period, however, some big business owners started to view competition with distrust because it undermined their own profit potential. They sought to eliminate or minimize competition, sometimes through secret agreements to fix prices at a certain limit, and sometimes by either buying weaker companies or drive them out of business. Critics of these large corporations labeled them robber barons, who are becoming an aristocratic class with undue wealth and power in the United States using shady means. They did this through two ways. First was vertical integration, the consolidation of numerous production functions, from the extraction of the raw materials to the distribution and marketing of the finished products under the direction of one firm. An example is Gustavus Swift controlled the aspects of meat packing. Then there's horizontal integration, the merger of competitors in the same industry by buying out competitors in the same industry. The barons of business. Now we'll look at the three major barons of business: Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. The first one is John D. Rockefeller. Standard Oil in 1870, Rockefeller began refining oil from the nearby fields in Pennsylvania with his initial investment of $4,000 in Cleveland, Ohio. Meeting with Cornelius Vanderbilt, he had promised to supply 60 barrels a day, although he could only do 30 barrels. He needed investors. Kerosene also has a very bad name, and Rockefeller convinces investors that oil refining, barrel making, shipping, and guaranteeing a uniform product that set the standard gets his investors creating the Standard Oil Company. For competition, he will ship his product around the country at cheap rates with Vanderbilt and refines more oil than Vanderbilt can actually ship. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad gives Rockefeller a 40% rebate for every barrel that ships, and Rockefeller begins to buy out his competitors. His goal was to own every refinery in the country. Through vertical integration, Rockefeller buys them and then shuts them down. To control the market, he reorganized his company into a trust. Trusts allow a trustee in the form of a corporation to manage other companies instead of owning them outright. Standard Oil becomes the country's first monopoly, and at age 33 he is the most powerful man in the country. Vanderbilt looks to stop Rockefeller, denying him the use of railroads by increasing the rates. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad tries to break into the oil business, and Rockefeller threatens to ship his oil on other railroads unless Scott reconsiders. Scott calls his bluff. Rockefeller sees transporting oil in short distances. He can also do it in long distances and cuts the railroads out for good with an oil pipeline that is 4,000 miles long, connecting the oil fields of Pennsylvania to his oil refineries in Cleveland, Ohio. As the result, the Pennsylvania Railroad loses half its business, and Scott will have to lay off half his workers and cut wages. The workers would turn violent and set fire to the train yards. 29 buildings and 1,200 train cars are going to be destroyed. In the end, Rockefeller's net worth was $150 million. about equivalent to $225 billion today. By the time of his death in 1937, Rockefeller's remaining fortune was largely tied up in permanent family trust and was estimated at $336 billion. Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie made his name in the steel industry, and by 1900, the Carnegie Steel Company was the world's largest industry, with 20,000 employees in mills that ran non-stop except on Independence Day. Andrew Carnegie came to America as an immigrant with only $3.25 in his pocket. At the age of 12, he'll work for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Pittsburgh. It is Tom Scott who would take him under his wing and sees him as someone to nurture. His big break came at the age of 24 as the manager of the company, and he'd oversee the expansion to the west. He is tasked to build a bridge expanding the Mississippi River. Then, that way, they can move. The problem was the bridge had to be over a mile long. Carnegie would invest everything into building of the bridge, using a new process that inexpensively made steel stronger called the Bessemer conversion process, combining with iron and carbon at over 2,000 degrees. This burns off the carbon impurities and then produces pure steel. He sees the future in steel and travels to steel mills, meets with scientists, and uses the Bessemer process to build a steel rail, which used to take about 2 weeks to now less than 15 minutes. With steel in place, construction begins, and he finishes the St. Louis Bridge in 1873. With Scott's help, he raises $21 million to build his first steel plant of 100 acres in Pittsburgh. The mill produces 225 tons of steel a day. Tom Scott would never recover from Rockefeller's in the panic of 1873, and without the railroads, loses his market for steel, and he blames Rockefeller. But skyscrapers are going to be the future of steel, not in rails, with the steel structure beams. 100,000 buildings of steel would be built in Chicago alone, and Carnegie would control 70% of all steel manufacturing in the country. J.P. Morgan has a controlling interest in manufacturing, railroads, and steel, and will bring them all together, consolidating steel and a complete takeover of Carnegie Steel. He sets up a meeting with Charles Schwab, Carnegie's right-hand man. Schwab tells Carnegie that he could see what he could sell steel to Morgan. Carnegie writes down the price of $480 million. This was higher than the budget of the U.S. government. Morgan would accept the offer, and he would become the richest man in the world and would create U.S. Steel, the biggest corporation in the world, and will dominate the steel business for 100 years and become the first billion-dollar industry. J. Pierpont Morgan. J.P. Morgan would make his money through the banking industry. He would take over failing companies and then turns them around. Julius Morgan, his father, founded a financial empire. JP is taught to invest with other people's money to make a fortune for yourself. At the age of 40, looks to create an identity of his own. He wants to build businesses from the ground up. In Edison Electric, Morgan believes electricity will revolutionize the world. He has Edison install electricity in his Fifth Avenue home. Morgan wants to know how much money it would take to power the city of New York and invest everything in electricity. In today's money, Morgan would invest $83 million into the Edison Electric Company and transform a building in Manhattan into a central power station. Niagara Falls is the world's largest power plant to be built into a 2.5-mile-long tunnel of bedrock. The water would flow through it and turn the turbines to transmit electricity to light the entire Northeast. Morgan would invest $3 million in Edison and bids on the contract. Whoever controls Niagara Falls controls the future of electricity. Morgan designs a smear campaign to lower the stock on Westinghouse. The investors sell off Westinghouse stock. No competition to win the contract. In a magnanimous and historic making gesture, Tesla said he tore up the contract, and he was, after all, grateful to the one man who believed in his invention, and that was George Westinghouse. And so he gives George Westinghouse his patents. Westinghouse now bids and was awarded the contract to create the powerhouse. This does not sit well with Morgan. Morgan would later then buy out the remaining shares of Edison Electric and make it into General Electric. Morganization was the task of taking companies that are fighting each other and bringing them together. This is what he would do to also make his additional money. In 1890, he controlled 1/6 of the nation's railroads. In addition, in a series of rapid acquisitions through mergers, Morgan bought out Carnegie Steel and Iron Holdings in 1901 and formed the U.S. Steel Corporation. This company, which employed over 168,000 people, became the first billion-dollar corporation. In the panic of 1893 that took place, in 1895, in the depths of the panic, the Federal Treasury was nearly out of gold. President Grover Cleveland would accept Morgan's offer to join with Rothschilds and supply the U.S. Treasury with 3.5 million ounces of gold to restore the Treasury surplus in exchange for a 30-year bond issue. This episode saved the Treasury but hurt Cleveland's standing with the agrarian wing of the Democratic Party and became an issue in the election of 1896 when banks came under a withering attack from William Jennings Bryan. The scary issue was J.P. Morgan seemed to have more gold than the United States government. Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck opened a mail-order company in the 1890s. By eliminating the middleman, they could ship goods from a catalog to people throughout the United States. Catalog businesses benefited many Americans in rural areas by making it possible for them to buy the kinds of goods that otherwise they would have to travel to cities to reach or wait for a traveling salesman to visit their area. The Gospel of Wealth. Andrew Carnegie's essay, The Gospel of Wealth, published in 1889, put into words that many of the big business leaders thought about their vast wealth and their social responsibilities. They saw poverty as a character flaw. Carnegie argued that the accumulation of wealth by certain individuals benefited the Anglo-Saxon race by allowing them to help others through philanthropy ventures. In philanthropy, Carnegie gave away $350 million, and Rockefeller did give away much of his wealth as well, especially to support education, medicine, the arts, and other causes. Rockefeller formed the Rockefeller Foundation that still funds philanthropic work today, and Carnegie made it his goal to give away most of his $400 million fortune before his death. The Horatio Alger stories was a series of best-selling tales about young rags-to-riches heroes that were first published in 1867, stressing the importance of neat clothes, cleanliness, thrift, and hard work. The books also highlighted the importance of chance and getting ahead and the responsibility of those better off to serve as positive role models. This Horatio Alger stories reinforced the gospel of wealth ideas, and their poster boy was no other than Andrew Carnegie. The Alliance of Business and Politics. Republicans and Big Business. At the state and federal levels during and after the American Civil War, the Republican Party and big business considered one another as mutually beneficial, especially because both supported protective tariffs. A series of acts were passed that would benefit both. First, the Merrill Tariff, which was passed during the Civil War, which doubled taxes on many imported items. The government used this to raise money to fight the war and reward businesses for their continued support of the Republican Party. The Republican Party remained committed to high tariffs throughout the rest of the 19th century. In the Legal Tender Act of 1862, the Republican-controlled Congress also passed other legislation that helped stabilize the U.S. economy and pay for the war, including the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which authorized the United States to issue greenbacks, which was paper money. The National Banking Act of 1863 then created a national bank that issued those greenbacks. Both of these measures led to a uniform paper currency in the nation that benefited the industry. Laissez-faire economics. During the late 19th century, the United States subscribed to a hands-off or laissez-faire, roughly a French term that means let them do as they will, approach to the economy. The government did not investigate the business practices and no legislation to protect workers and consumers. Business leaders spent time and a lot of money to ensure government officials stayed out of their business. An industrial society, the ways of the wealthy. By 1900, there were over 4,000 millionaires in the United States, compared to a few dozen in 1861. A few were women, including Madam C.J. Walker, the daughter of freed Louisiana slaves. Like the captains of industry, Madam C.J. Walker saw a need that was not being met: hair products designed for African American women. She created and sold in the beginning her products door to door, building up an empire, and would become the first self-made female millionaire in the United States. The nouveau riches were a growing wealthy class of millionaires in the United States, often consisted of financiers and industrialists who flaunted their wealth by throwing lavish parties, like a dinner for a dog whom was given a $15,000 diamond necklace. Mansions in Newport, Rhode Island, Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and New York's Fifth Avenue were built. Mostly were white, Republican voting Protestants.
The growing middle class. The term middle class at first appeared in the 1830s and was commonplace by the 1870s. More and more Americans came to view themselves as members of the middle class. These were white-collar professionals, which included editors, engineers, accountants, supervisors, managers, marketers, scientists, and retailers. In turn, these middle-class employees increased the demand for services from attorneys, physicians, public employees, and storekeepers. The number of professors, journalists, nurses, and social workers also rose dramatically during this time period of 1870 to 1900. The middle class would make up more than one-fourth of all non-agriculture employees by 1910. For middle-class women, they generally were unmarried and worked as clerks, secretaries, salespersons, teachers, and librarians, replacing men who traditionally worked those positions. One example is Jane Addams. After graduating from Rockford College in Illinois in 1881, Addams found meaning as a social worker after she founded Hull House in Chicago. Hull House provided education, skills training, and mentoring to young women and immigrants. Addams and her group of social workers helped encourage many middle-class women to look beyond the cult of domesticity and provide social services, what she called the real world. The Ladies' Home Journal was a magazine that most middle-class women would subscribe to during this period, which viewed their domestically oriented lives as real world. They embraced domestic life and subscribed to magazines that aimed to help women become better mothers, wives, and homemakers. The most popular of these magazines was, of course, the Ladies' Home Journal, which had almost 2 million subscribers by 1910. Its editor, Edward Bach, sought to provide a, quote, great clearinghouse of information, end quote, for middle-class women on topics such as cooking, politics, sewing, religion, and fiction. And talking about the cult of domesticity, since women were, under this cult of domesticity, supposed to take care of the home and the children and her husband, well, as middle-class women, this was now provided by cooks, nannies, and maids, therefore giving them more time to look at social issues and how to correct them. Creation of the suburbs. In the United States, the wealthy and middle class migrated to the healthier suburbs to escape the problems of the cities, which included disease, crime, waste, water pollution, and air pollution. The middle-class families moved out of larger cities to create suburbs for several reasons. Low-cost, abundant land reduced the price of buying a home. The inexpensive transportation now by rail made commuting to work easy. The spread of new construction methods, such as the building of wooden balloon frame houses, reduced the cost of building homes. Some people wanted to live in an all-white community because of their ethnic and racial prejudice based on the new immigrants and African Americans moving into the city. Many people enjoyed having grass, privacy, and detached individual houses. The world's first suburbs. Owning a single-family home surrounded by an ornamental lawn would become the American ideal for a comfortable living and a hallmark of being in the middle class. City Beautiful, as mentioned before, the problems of the cities would slowly convince reform-minded citizens in city governments the need for municipal water purification, sewer systems, water disposal, street lighting, police departments, and zoning laws to regulate urban development. This would lead to the 1890s to a City Beautiful movement to design grand plans to remake American cities with tree-lined boulevards, public parks, and cultural attractions. Changes in education. Elementary schools after 1865 continued to teach the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the traditional moral values through text, such as the McGuffey Readers. New compulsory laws dramatically increased the number of students enrolled in public schools. As a result, the literacy rate rose to 90% of the population by 1900. The practice of sending your children to kindergarten was a concept borrowed from Germany, became very popular, and reflected the growing interest in early childhood education. Perhaps even more significant than lower grade schools was the growing support for tax-supported public high schools. At first, these schools followed the college preparatory curriculum of private academies, but soon the public high schools became more comprehensive and began to emphasize vocational and citizenship education in the United States. For higher education, the growing demand for white-collar workers promoted a sharp increase in the number and the sizes of U.S. colleges in the late 1800s due to, first, the land-grant colleges under the Morrill Land Grant of 1862. Also, wealthy philanthropists who founded new colleges like John D. Rockefeller, who started the University of Chicago, and Stetson, here in Volusia County, started Stetson University. And there are others like Cornelius Vanderbilt, and more. The new colleges for women, such as Smith, Bryn Mawr, and Mount Holyoke, were also created. And by 1900, 71% of colleges admitted women to their schools. Support of education for African Americans found that more than 50 private and public colleges and universities, including Fisk, Howard, Morehouse, and Mary Harry Medical College. This was due mostly of the Jim Crow laws in the South that would not admit African Americans to their public schools. The college curriculum also changed greatly in the late 19th century. Charles W. Eliot, the president of Harvard in 1869, reduced the number of required courses and introduced electives to accommodate the teaching of modern languages and the sciences, such as physics, chemistry, biology, and geology. Johns Hopkins University was founded in Baltimore in 1876 as the first American institution to specialize in advanced graduate studies. Johns Hopkins emphasized research and free inquiry. As a result of such innovations in curriculum, the United States produced the first generation of scholars who would compete with their intellectual achievements of Europeans. As curriculum was changing, colleges added social activities such as fraternities and intercollegiate sports, additions that would soon dominate the college experience, even today for many students. The social sciences. The application of scientific method in the theory of evolution revolutionized the social sciences in the late 19th century. These included psychology, sociology, anthropology, and political science. Richard T. Ely of Johns Hopkins attacked laissez-faire economics, who thought it as a dogmatic and outdated, and used economics to study labor unions, trusts, and other existing economic institutions, not only to understand them, but to suggest remedies for economic problems of the day. The evolutionary theory influenced leading sociologists like Lester F. Ward, political scientists like Woodrow Wilson, and historians like Frederick Jackson Turner to study the dynamic process of actual human behavior instead of logical abstractions. This gave way to the professions. In the legal profession, Oliver Wendell Holmes taught that law should evolve with the times and respond to changing needs and not remain restricted by legal precedences and judicial decisions of the past. Clarence Darrow, a very famous defense lawyer, argued that criminal behavior could be caused by a person's environment of poverty, neglect, and abuse. Other professions, such as doctors, educators, and social workers, also began applying scientific theory and methodology to their work.
The working class. By modern standards, the working conditions during the Industrial Revolution were often dangerous. The average work week was 59 hours, and the average wage, equivalent to today's currency, was $3.50 an hour. Wages rose during the Gilded Age, but skilled laborers often received better pay than unskilled workers. Unskilled workers were also the first to be laid off or have their wages cut when recessions and depressions threatened the economy. For working women and children who were willing to work for lower wages than men, they were often hired by mills, mines, factories, and large businesses. The average wage for a woman in manufacturing was $7 per week, whereas an unskilled man earned $10 per week on average. Women also found jobs as cooks, nannies, and housemaids. Child labor. After the Civil War, millions of children took jobs outside the home instead of working on their family farms. By 1880, 1/6 of the population of children worked a full-time job. Boys worked deep in coal mines and girls worked in textile mills. And by 1881, only 7 states had anti-child labor laws requiring children to be at least 12 before being hired. Parents who may have regretted starting their children working early often supported child labor because they desperately needed the income that they brought into the family. The first forms of protest against labor conditions were disorganized, as many of the workers in these conditions were recent immigrants who often spoke a variety of languages and faced prejudices. Most of the farmers who worked in these conditions also were not familiar with the idea of civilized protest. In addition, early organized labor groups faced obstacles such as blacklisting by companies owners and hiring of scabs, non-union workers, when unionized workers went on strike. Labor organizations and strikes. The Molly Maguires, named after a woman who led a massive protest against landlords in Ireland in the 1840s, a group of Irish-American coal miners, the Molly Maguires, used violence to achieve better working conditions in the Pennsylvania coal mines. During 1874 through 1875, the group's terrorism caused the mine owners to hire Pinkerton Detective Agency, a private detective firm, to infiltrate the Mollies and stop the movement. Eventually, 24 members of this group were convicted of murder and kidnapping by the non-Irish jury, and 10 would be hanged. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was a railroad strike notable for the way the workers cooperated with one another. It's important because it was the first interstate strike in American history, resulting from the financial panic of 1873. In 1877, during which the railroad companies drastically cut wages by 10%, the strike eventually erupted in violence, and order was restored when federal troops intervened. The Sandlot Incident. At a sandlot in San Francisco, a meeting to show support for striking railroad workers became an attack on Chinese immigrants. The Chinese were easy scapegoats as they tended to work for less and were perceived to steal American jobs. This would eventually lead to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which would ban Chinese immigration into the United States until it was finally repealed in 1943. The labor movement. In 1866, the National Labor Union was founded, comprising of labor and reform groups more interested in political and social reforms than in collective bargaining. Before disbanding in 1873, the NLU secured the Contract Labor Act,
which encouraged employers to import workers by paying passage. The Knights of Labor were led by Uriah Smith Stevens, and the Knights of Labor was a secret organization designed to protect its members from retaliation from employers. Its members, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands at its peak, allowed skilled and unskilled laborers to join respective of race or gender. Mother Jones. Mary Jones, the self-declared mother of the labor movement, promoted higher wages, shorter hours, safer workplaces, and child labor restrictions. Although she lost most of the strikes in which she participated, she lived to see her views become accepted by unions across the country. Anarchists believe that any form of government is abusive, controlled by the rich to exploit the poor. Many labor unions during the late 19th century pushed for the abolition of government to achieve this goals, which we will see hurt a lot of labor movements. One of the examples is the Haymarket Riot. In 1886, the Knights of Labor rallied in the Chicago's Haymarket Square to promote the 8-hour workday. A bomb was thrown into the crowd of police officers. One officer was killed and several others were wounded. Although no one involved with the Knights was found guilty in this affair, they were guilty by association, and soon thereafter its membership dwindled. The speakers were German anarchists, immigrants who were found guilty of inciting a riot that led to the death of the policeman. Several were found guilty of first-degree murder and were hanged. The backlash. After the Haymarket Riot in 1886, there were about 1,400 strikes across the United States that involved about 700,000 workers. These strikes led to a backlash against the labor unions. This is due to, even though a lot of people could empathize what the union was trying to do, but once the strikes turned violent and people were hit and killed, they would lose their message. Something that we'll see much later that Dr. King would take into very high consideration of nonviolent protest. Protecting workers' rights. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, in 1886 was organized. 25 skilled workers organized this group and emphasized a few workplace issues rather than a broad social program. Led by Samuel Gompers, the AFL allowed only skilled workers as its members and very gradually emerged as the permanent union in the United States. Hostile to blacks and women due to them accepting lower wages, the AFL became the major union for skilled workers and stressed collective bargaining. Representatives of a union negotiating with management on the behalf of all members. The Homestead Steel Strike. In 1892, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, the nation's largest craft unions, went on strike at Carnegie's Homestead Works near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. An attempt to break the strike ended in bloodshed when members of the Pinkerton Detective Agency were brought in to confront the strikers. Eventually, state militias were sent in to protect workers not involved in the strike. The Pullman strike paralyzed the economies of 27 states in 1894, and members of the American Railway Union, the ARU, led by Eugene V. Debs, working at the Pullman Palace Car Company, went on strike. No member of the ARU would handle the Pullman cars, sleeper railroads, and they were very popular. And by mid-July, Midwest Railway lines were struck with cars on tracks that no one would touch. Eventually, President Cleveland ordered federal troops to remove the cars from the tracks, citing federal authority to deliver the mail, which at the time was done by train. The Latimer Massacre. In August 1897, anthracite coal workers at the Latimer mine near Hazleton, Pennsylvania, were laid off. The laborers who stayed were forced to accept lower wages, longer workdays, increased costs in the company town, and dangerous working conditions. About 3 workers died every 2 days. Many of the 10,000 workers, mostly immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe, went on strike and argued that they were working in conditions close to slavery. After management ceased to fulfill a promised wage raise, the mine owners enlisted the help of the county sheriff and 150 armed men to stop the strike and make the workers leave. In the end, 19 unarmed miners were killed and 39 others were wounded. The event and the aftermath of the trial convinced about 15,000 miners to join the United Mine Workers Union, the Western Federation of Miners. William Big Bill Haywood and other militant labor leaders in the West sought to organize smelter workers and other hard rock miners. The Western Federation of Miners, WFM, was reviewed as a radical labor union by many and became part of the violent confrontations between the WFM and mine operators and the private armies, secret spies, state militias, and federal troops that opposed it. The WFM recruited skilled and unskilled workers of all races, ethnic groups, and genders. The International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. A meeting of some of the leading socialists and union leaders in Chicago in 1905 resulted in the formation of the International Workers of the World, which was supposed to be a revolutionary labor union, open to workers across the world regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, age, or citizenship status, who were willing to renounce capitalism. Because of their militant anti-capitalist stance, many viewed the Wobblies with suspicion. The organization also suffered from internal divisions. Bill Haywood helped hold the group together, however, and argued for the use of strikes over labor agreements for basic human rights for all. The future. The Gilded Age industrial complex created a system in which owners were vastly separated from their workers in both wealth and working conditions. This set the stage for our government entities to intervene to find equilibrium. And so concludes our lecture on industrialization in the late 19th century.